Machine Head. We return to this band that has, over the course of the past 2 years now, really given us a lot to talk about. They've been a group that has been perplexing in many ways, but in other avenues have been absolutely glorious. They have given us the highs of highs, and they've also delivered some of the lowest of lows. Their albums, which number 9 full lengths, have been an interesting mix, almost a curious witch's brew of strong and powerful metal and curious trend hopping in the eyes of some. This band has seen so many different sides, but its foremost member, Rob Flynn, has been around for them all. The keynote aspect of what Machine Head has been able to give us. So let's look at these albums from 9 to 1, and let's give them the treatment that they deserve. Let's rank them all Machine Head. Number 9 is the obvious one in this case, which is Catharsis. Catharsis was released in 2018. It's the most recent album that we have from these guys until the next one eventually drops, and we know it will. And this was one that caught everybody by surprise and infuriated many. Of course, one could say that the way in which culture has changed and the world has changed is part of the reason why this album was received so poorly. Though both musically it was a conundrum, considering so many of the powerful, and actual good sounding songs were then offset with ones that felt that they were completely hokey or just trying to, look at what was happening in 2018 or around it and try to replicate it. Rob Flynn actually does his best, heavy metal rap on this, and it's extremely strange. And then there's tracks such as Bastards. Songs that were supposed to be real powerful anthems, but instead sounded like a man of 50 that was coming off like a 16-year-old child that was throwing a temper tantrum, wearing the backwards hat like Hillary Clinton. "Sup, young people? How are you?" This album completely and totally bombed, not to mention really started to expose and unravel somebody that is not been able to recover as of since, if their most recent song outputs are any indication. Number 8 is Supercharger, and we now go back to a time where Machine Head initially strayed from the course. After a couple of successful albums, ones that seemed to really be rooted within the groove metal sound and was showing Machine Head to be truly something special, the band decided to take a hard right turn and create something that had a little bit more in line with nu metal than anything else. One could say that was a bit of an experiment. One could say it was not meant to be what the band was going to be. However, that's not what this album sounds like. It instead sounds a little bit more deliberate, like this was a calculated move, something that they were aiming to do, mostly because it was. And these were songs that, while some of them were decent, most fell flat, and it has become an album that has largely been forgotten over the years. Number 7 is The Burning Red. This one's above Supercharger because some of its songs do have a bit more memory. I can remember, for example, in college 15 years ago listening to this album and thinking, some of these are okay, they're not bad. But what happened to some of the stuff that we were hearing with their first 2 albums? What happened to this band? What has gone on to cause this sort of changeover? It was the first time where this band really experienced that backlash from the fan base. It was the first time where the fans felt a bit deceived by what they were hearing. Machine Head seemed to have such a core value or a core sound whenever they first came out, and all of a sudden these albums were turning that on its head and seemed like they were trying to follow the trend of nu metal, which was extremely big during this and Supercharger's release periods. Either way, it's a disc that's not as bad as Supercharger, but definitely has some of the same conundrums that that album possesses. Number 6 is Bloodstone and Diamonds. Now, Machine Head, as I said, has had the highest of highs. They've had periods where they have sounded amazing, and it seemed like they could do no wrong. Every album that they released, there was a good chance that it was destined to be talked about as one of the best of the year. Bloodstone and Diamonds was one of those albums. However, you were already starting to see some of the cracks and fissures of this era coming to a close. By comparison to some of the other albums that we were able to get during this late 2000s, early 2010s era, this was definitely the one that felt the weakest. It didn't have the same real energy behind it, and it seemed like the whole entire band was just getting a bit tired. Some of the ideas felt like they were a bit recycled, but at the same time, the music still sounded good. And as an overall presentation, it wasn't too bad. But it's one that, as you return to it in memory, does not have the same hype not to mention the same energy behind some of the others that were delivered around the same era. Number 5 is Through the Ashes of Empires. This is a forgotten gem of an album that came out after the Burning Red and Supercharger, one that was barely promoted and barely seen. This was actually an album that I didn't even listen to for the first time until well after the Blackening was even released. I didn't know that it existed. It's crazy. But this is a disc that showed that the band wanted to turn the corner a little bit. They didn't want to be as associated with what they had done for the past 2 albums. It's also part of the reason why they are sometimes labeled as trend hoppers, considering once they saw that one experiment was failing, they decided to go back to what was working. This sowed the seeds for what we would get on future albums, such as the Blackening, and definitely showed that this band had that capability within. So it was showing a bit of a modernization. It was showing a little bit of growth. That maturity was slowly but surely starting to come back and show itself. And this album, as a very quiet underground hit, was able to restore some of the good faith to Machine Head, though not nearly as much as future releases would. Number 4 is Unto the Locust. How do you try to top an album such as The Blackening? You probably know where that album's placement is going to be on this list. You probably knew from the moment that you turned on this video. But Unto the Locust had the almost unfair task of trying to supplant it, and it did its best. It had a great sound to it. Its aesthetic was almost similar to this, but it was just not as surprising considering we already had The Blackening. How are you going to build off of this? Some outlets had called The Blackening the album of the 2000s, album of the decade. It's crazy. This, however, was an album that did its best. It held its own, and it continued the legend. At this point, Machine Head was at the highest of its highs. And Unto the Locust was only able to deliver for the fans yet another thing to celebrate. Number 3, The More Things Change. This is their landmark second album. Didn't exactly have the same response as the first. The strength of the material was a little weaker, but still showed Machine Head as a thrusting machine that had a fantastic future. It still showed that this band was firmly rooted within great groove and aggressive melody, and that they had the ability to songwrite with the best of them. Machine Head almost looked like a band that could take metal out of the trenches, out of the underground in the 1990s, as it was slowly but surely seeming to fade away, at least in the eyes of everybody, and bring it back to the light. It seemed like this would be the style that would do so, but of course that was wrong. Nu metal was the style that ended up bringing metal back to the surface, as many people don't want to admit. But The More Things Change was able to shine a beacon for the remainder of heavy metal, and it's just unfortunate that the band didn't take advantage of their own beacon. Number 2 is Burn My Eyes, the absolutely destructive debut of Machine Head, one that showed that this band had exceptional songwriting capability, not to mention the impassioned lyricism, not to mention the impassioned singing of Rob Flynn really was producing a spark, almost like adrenaline, to the heavy metal vein. It was an absolutely amazing album, one that was able to thrust this band into the mainstream and immediately get them some recognition. Recognition that would fade away over time, however, to have this immediate utility was something fantastic. This band, with Burn My Eyes, produced some of its classic trademarks, some of the hallmarks that to this day still hold up, such as David. These songs still hold up all of these years later, and at times, if you go back and revisit these tracks and listen to them, you almost wonder just where it all went wrong. You almost wonder just why Rob Flynn went crazy. Some have said that he's been crazy ever since Burn My Eyes, that some of the lyricism really shows this and displays it. And over time, it's only gotten worse. However, listening to Burn My Eyes feels like a time capsule all the way back to 1999 whenever I picked up this album, and whenever I heard the first opening notes, was immediately blown away. And that brings us to number 1, which is The Blackening. You knew this was going to happen. You knew it. Because even with my love of Burn My Eyes, even with my nostalgia for that disc, I can't deny that album. I can't deny The Blackening. The Blackening was one of those albums that whenever it came out, I passed over it. Because I had been tricked before by this band whenever I listened to Supercharger, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be tricked again. I didn't even know about Through the Ashes of Empires. But then I listened to it, and I realized this is a brand new band. This is a different group. I wondered why everybody was all of a sudden talking about Machine Head again. And it's because they released an album that was glorious. All the facets of their old style was gone. This was now a band that still had groove, but now we're expanding upon that by having songwriting for days. By taking their ideas and expanding them out, adding atmosphere, giving it a lot more room to breathe. And that was one of the best things that Machine Head could do for their sound. The tightness and the compression that they had in some of those 4 to 5 minute long tracks was fantastic because it was almost like a 10-ton, hammer that was smashing upon your chest and not giving you room to breathe, not giving you space to move. But with the atmosphere, it was almost like a slower torture, or in this case, it was more of a slow ascent to the top of heavy metal ranks. I think what also causes this album to have the reputation that it does is not only based around its majesty and based around just how good it is, but also the fact that it seemed to come completely out of left field as a total surprise. It was not something that anybody expected. Sometimes the best things come completely from out of nowhere, like an RKO. There's a reason why that meme lives. The Blackening came out of nowhere to really show that Machine Head was still a band that not only had great utility, terrific songwriting, but they also were a band that evolved, and evolved the right way for this album, and for this string of albums, to really take themselves right to the top. And that's our list. What's your list of the top 9 Machine Head albums, 1 through 9, to rank them all? Let me know in the comments below. My name is coverkillernation. Thank you for inviting me into your homes all these years. I do appreciate it. And I'll talk to you next time. Take care.